genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Farklı ülkelerden, farklı bölgelerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel meselelere ilişkin her hafta farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Dünyayı Ekotürk ekranında buluşturuyoruz. Bu hafta çok kıymetli bir konuğumuz var İstanbul'da kendisi. Dünyanın önde gelen saygın uluslararası hukuk uzmanlarından ABD'nin Princeton Üniversitesi'nden emeritus profesör. Eski Birleşmiş Milletler Özel Filistin raportörü aynı zamanda yıllarını aslında İsrail-Filistin sorununa vermiş bu alanda. Özellikle insan hakları ihlalleri, İsrail'in işlediği insanlık suçları, savaş suçları üzerine uzun yıllardır çok sayıda makaleye, kitaba imza atmış bir isim. Kendisiyle bugün hem İsrail'in 7 Ekim'den sonra ve aslında öncesinden itibaren aslında çok daha öncesinden itibaren işlediği suçları, kendisinin başını çektiği sivil bir inisiyatif olan Gazze Mahkemesi, Gaza Tribunal'ı ve üzerine yine çok sık düşündüğü, yazıp çizdiği küresel düzeni, uluslararası düzenin akıbetini konuşacağız. Profesör Doktor Richard Falk bizlerle. Hocam, welcome to Istanbul. Hoş geldiniz. It's a pleasure for me to sit with you, to have this discussion with you today. Thank you very much for joining my show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Professor Falk, of course we will talk, we have a lot to talk, but please let me ask you first for our audience. I think Gaza Tribunal brought you here today to Istanbul. First of all, could you tell us more about this civil society initiative? The proceedings, how did it start, how did you get involved, and what are the future prospects? Let's start with this.
Well, it's a rather long and complicated story, but it started with several Turkish sponsors of the initiative that came to see me and my Turkish wife in our summer place in Yalikavak and tried to persuade me to become the president of this Gaza tribunal and had a general idea of what it would be. And I had written and spoken of my own frustrations with the way in which the Gaza ordeal of the Palestinian people was playing out, and I felt that it was a challenge I couldn't refuse. I knew it would be a challenge because it was a complex administrative undertaking of bringing together people from around the world, but it seemed like a way of dealing with my own frustrations and responding to the failure of the formal system of justice, either as expressed by the behavior of governments, including my own, the U.S. government, which was complicit in this this Israeli genocidal assault on the people of Gaza, and the structure of normative or international legal authority that was centered in the UN. It had not been able to do anything meaningfully to stop the violence or to protect the Palestinian people. So it was from this sense of frustration, and I had participated in earlier civil tribunals that had a meaningful role, and I knew very well the original civil tribunal of this character which was formed by the Bertrand Russell Foundation in opposition to the Vietnam War as it was developing, and brought together some of the leading world intellectuals and moral authority figures, and seemed to have an impact on the way in which people thought about their own governments and acted in a way that showed a patriotism to humanity as well as a loyalty to their particular state. And that was all part
That's how
of
it
the background.
started. Okay. Professor, of course, since October 7, but not since October 7, actually, the Palestinian tragedy started long before October 7. We all know that, and you are a witness, first-hand witness, because you were also United Nations Special Rapporteur on Palestine. So the tragedy started long before October 7, but since then, since October 7, we have witnessed an unprecedented tragedy. Schools were bombed, hospitals were bombed, refugee camps were bombed, and we watched this live in front of our many eyes. So you touched upon that, of course, but I also want to ask you at this point, how and why did the world fail to stop Israel's brutal attacks in Gaza? Is it lack of deterrence in international law, strong regional will, or is it due to the power of the Israeli lobby, or simply no one cared Palestinians and Palestinian blood means nothing? What is the core, the reason behind this failure or ignorance or whatever you call it?
Well, that's the haunting question that faces all of us that have been disturbed by this process. And I'm not sure there is a single core explanation, but rather a series of factors that have played into what is such a disappointing way of responding. Of course, the close connection between Israel and the US and the European Union had something to do with the willingness of Israel to undertake something as extreme as this. They knew they had this geopolitical backing. Secondly, the government that came to govern Israel in the beginning of 2023 was widely seen as the most extreme government Israel had ever had in its history. And what made it extreme was its determination to finish the Zionist project by gaining sovereignty over as much of mandated Palestine as it could obtain. In other words, it wanted to eliminate Palestine as a separate reality, what was being called occupied Palestine, and what was supposed to be the foundation of a two-state solution. This extremist government wanted to destroy that kind of consensus that had formed at an international level. So they, in a sense, ignored the warnings that an attack was coming on October 7th. There were repeated warnings given to Netanyahu by Egyptian intelligence, by American CIA, and whether they knew the exact nature of the attack, what they did know was that Hamas was planning and organizing a significant initiative of this kind. which from the Palestinian point of view was primarily an act of resistance. It was not seen as an act of aggression, or it was in response to what others have called incremental genocide that preceded October 7th and was deliberately provoked by Netanyahu going before the UN General Assembly with a map showing the new Middle East that completely erased the existence of Palestine. And one of the motivations for the attack was to express to the world, we're still here. The Palestinians wanted the message of their determination not to be erased historically or politically. So it was in that background that this occurred. Now, why the world let it happen? The world has never responded to severe human rights violations, including the Holocaust.
Right.
I mean, you could make the same argument that the liberal democracies let Nazism develop and proceed as it has. It has done nothing about the Myanmar massacre in Rohingya, directed at the Rohingya people. So there is a consistent pattern of governmental indifference to the internal wrongdoing that that endangers the life of some minority or some adversary of the governing elite.
Mm-hmm.
And the only exceptions to that are when the people of the world are mobilized and active, as happened in relation to South Africa, and also happened in a very vivid way in the United States during the Vietnam War. The anti-war movement of civil society is what stopped the Vietnam War. It was not a government reflection on the failure of military tactics and so on. It was civil activism, civic activism that brought the war to an end, and it was facilitated by middle-class Americans who didn't want their son to die in a war that made no sense from a U.S. point of view.
Do you see a similar civil society activism? Because we have seen huge demonstrations, especially in the Western capitals. Do you see a similar mobilization globally? Because now, on the other hand, we have Trump, US president for the second term, and he is now throwing the ideas of this Gaza Riviera plan. He is planning to displace millions of Palestinians to Jordan, to Egypt. Even the civil society is strong enough. Do you think, is this enough to stop him from doing whatever his plans are?
Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball that lets me see this unfolding reality. It seems like such an absurd plan, not only the ethnic cleansing of the Gazan population, but the idea that the U.S. will suddenly take over and own this property. It's the real estate entrepreneur in Trump that sees this as a very promising real estate project which has no real political foundation or doesn't seem to have political traction. Now, whether he can coerce some kind of implementation of the proposal is in some doubt. I'm not sure Israel likes the proposal except for the ethnic cleansing. That's a high priority for them. But the idea that the U.S. would come and own Gaza when it has valuable oil and
Of course, it's not
gas,
also good for Israelis. And
or
Professor, what is the role of course, we have been criticizing, most of the time put the blame on West, their double standards, its hypocrisy, so many things. But I also want to ask you and get your perspectives on the regional countries, Muslim countries, Arab countries, countries in the region, neighboring countries, mainly Egypt, namely. Because on one hand, of course, okay, we are discussing Trump's crazy ideas, lunatic ideas, but on the other hand, there are regional actors who say that there is no alternative to his plan. So what is the role of the regional countries, Arab countries, Muslim countries? Do you see any unity? Is there a lack of regional unity also? What do you see on the other hand of the story?
well, I think in the first place you have to distinguish between the Arab regimes and the people.
Right.
And the people are overwhelmingly for the Palestinian struggle. And it's, in one sense, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and ruler of Saudi Arabia, summarized his position by saying, I don't care about Palestine, but my people do. And so what he meant by that was that Saudi Arabia had to pretend to be concerned about what was happening, but it had no strategic interest in doing so. And I think the Palestinian struggle is a cause of some anxiety for the Arab governments in the region, because it's a democratic struggle that in one sense inspires people in the other Arab countries to engage in challenges to their autocratic governments. There is no democracy in the important Arab countries. Right. And those governments are as opposed to Hamas as is Israel itself.
Right.
And now they don't acknowledge that, but their behavior exhibits that. And I think it is a great disappointment that there hasn't been much more tangible show of solidarity. Now they are being sort of forced into strong rhetoric of condemnation. I mean, and this Trump proposal is so far out of the box that they're scared to ignore it, and they have to respond.
But still, the main focus seems to be eliminating Hamas and continue to maybe relations with Israel. By the way, speaking of this, Professor Falk, do you think, or did you ever think Abraham Accords in the region, a normalization process with Israel, was a good idea to make a solution, a long-term solution?
No, I thought it was a opportunistic and bad idea because it was a way of saying Israel is legitimate in its behavior without addressing the Palestinian grievances. It was premature. If Israel had been forthcoming in working out a genuine, just peace, not a Bantustan of the South African type, but not the two-state solution, in my view, was always suspect, because the Palestinian state was to be permanently demilitarized and neutralized next to an Israel that was fully militarized and would control the borders and dominate the security relation. So it was not meant, I think, to be accepted. It was meant to quiet public opinion as to the extent that it was seeking some kind of balanced outcome. Mm-hmm. And the balanced outcome, for instance, that the UN proposed, a partition, also denied the Palestinians any agency over their own future. The UN never consulted the Palestinian people, but yet they divided the country. And that has been all along, that everybody other than the Palestinians are trying to tell the Palestinians what they should be prepared to settle for.
Unfortunately. Professor Falk, you're an American Jew. Because a lot of us still trying to understand when it comes to US-Israel strategic alliance, when it comes to US unconditional support, which we saw especially following October 7. So we are still trying to understand the rationale behind this. So my question is a bit long, but in the Israel lobby and US foreign policy, Mearsheimer and Walt argue that the US support for Israel is largely driven by lobbying efforts rather than strategic interests. However, some scholars think Israel remains a key, crucial geopolitical ally, irrespective of lobbying influence. So given your expertise and also personal history, family background, given your expertise in international law and US foreign policy, I really want to hear your thoughts. Do you see the US-Israel relationship as primarily products of political pressure, or is there a legitimate strategic rationale that explains or justifies this unconditional support despite Israel's violations of international law?
Yes, that's a very important question. Let me answer it historically first. Up to 1967, I think it was largely influenced by liberal guilt over not doing more to stop the Holocaust, and by the Zionist network that was mobilizing political pressure effectively on Congress and the government. After 67, the attitude changed, and the internal questioning of the wisdom of alienating the Arab world and jeopardizing energy resources changed, and the Pentagon and State Department felt that Israel was a crucial strategic ally. So that after 67, you had the combination of strategic interests and the Zionist network of well-funded pressure, and which Israel encouraged, of course, with a lot of economic subsidies, and so that neither explanation in this recent period, without taking account of the other, is convincing. It's the combination of the two. And it's really the Zionist project And Zionism was a movement within Judaism and was always controversial with Jews. And it became, after the Holocaust, it became somewhat less controversial so long as Israel had a sort of secular state. People felt, Jews felt, that Israel deserved and needed a sanctuary from the repetition of this kind of genocidal attack. Of course, there was no justification for solving the European problem of anti-Semitism at the expense of the Palestinian people. And that's what I call the original sin of the European support, Euro-American support for the creation of Israel.
Mm-hmm. Now, considering the fact that, Professor, post-World War II or the current international order, alliances, traditional alliances, Western alliances, US and Europe as well, is crumbling, obviously, in front of our eyes. Do you also see, this is a kind of broader question, I know, but do you see the emergence of strong alternative institutions or coalitions that could challenge the Western-centric system? I am asking you also with regard to growing influence of China and others, strengthening cooperation between them, China, Russia, Iran, and because some people argue that this non-democratic promotion of values maybe in the future is not going to solve anything, but it will bring a whole new chaos to the world. So what is the alternative? What do you see from here? What is the alternative? And do you think the alternative is going to bring good to the world?
Well, again, that's a hard question to answer without a good crystal ball. But I think there were these tendencies to challenge American hegemony, American-led leadership and domination, especially centered in the global South,
right,
and in cooperative relation with China and to some extent even Russia. And it was symbolized or institutionalized in the formation of the BRICS,
right,
which was a kind of counter-Western alliance that threatens particularly the domination of the dollar as the current reserve currency for the world. And one has to remember that after the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US emerged as the sole geopolitical actor, and China was still solving its domestic problems and achieving remarkable economic growth, and Russia was recovering from its defeat in the Cold War, so that you had a period where U.S. responsibility was translated into a kind of quasi-imperial relationship to the world. We're building military bases all over the world, 800 military bases, having special forces operate in a whole series of countries. And that provoked a lot of reaction and criticism that came gradually to the surface. And so you had this development. Now, as far as the future is concerned, there's two possibilities that seem to me to be plausible. And one is in the background of the Trump diplomacy, and that is a new geopolitical alignment with Russia and China. and basically marginalizing Europe and dominating the global South. That seems to be his real vision of a world run by the powerful, not adhering to legal constraints, not being, not shaping policy cooperatively or through international institutions. Trump himself is very anti-UN, anti-internationalist. Right. So that geopolitical solution is one avenue to the future. The second avenue is a growth of a polycentric world order with a restored kind of balance, China, Western kind of new Cold War rivalry, and possibly with Russia involved on the Chinese side, a north-south axis of conflict with the BRICS playing an important role, and a sort of decentering of this post-Cold War U.S. dominance. And so one idea is geopolitical, the other is polycentric. And the polycentric idea is probably combined with cooperative problem solving for climate change, migration, some other issues, maybe strengthening the UN and having a different trajectory.
So you are not very pessimistic about the future of the world order then, Professor Falk, am I right?
No, you're wrong. No, I'm quite pessimistic about it.
I was trying to...
If the present tendencies are allowed to persist, which involve the rise of autocratic leadership in most of the important countries in the world, and a focus on ultranationalism, the common problems of humanity are neglected. And it's one of the costs of this Gaza-Ukraine wars. They take all the attention away from climate change and from achieving some sort of ecological balance, dealing with problems of human displacement coming out of changing conditions in different countries, the immigration issues that are being faced.
I was actually trying to be sarcastic and ironic that you are quite optimistic, but you are pessimistic. In the history of 80 years, 90 years even, considering your expertise, was there any, I mean, is this the darkest moment in our history? Because most of the time we, as people who are living in this age, feel like this is the darkest moment of history. What do you think? What do you feel, Professor?
Yes, I share that view. I felt relatively hopeful about the future after the Vietnam War and the success of the anti-colonial movements. I thought that showed a flow of history that was liberating people from domination and allowing a kind of cooperative world order to emerge. The US and the liberal democracies, while not behaving perfectly, represented at least liberal values in a world that could be made gradually more humanistic and sensitive to living with the natural habitat rather than thinking of nature as there to be dominated and exploited for human pleasures and prosperity. But those ideas of the 50 years ago have been displaced by these tendencies, including a vacuum in global leadership. There are very few important countries with leaders with any kind of positive political vision.
By the way, Professor, speaking of also, you are working on Ukraine and Russia, and I think you are working on a also new book on the topic, on the subject. Considering the fact that President Zelensky was also recently in Turkey, how do you see the handling of two major conflicts? On the one hand, Russia, Ukraine, and on the other hand, Israel, Palestine, Gaza specifically. Handling of the two major crises for the past 3 years. What are the double standards? You already knew all of it. Of course, the world structure, the international system is a key here. But still, how do you see the two major conflicts and their handlings?
Well, I think that was the great failure of Biden as the pre-Trump president, who rejected diplomacy and sought to have a Ukrainian war funded and supplied with weapons by the NATO countries and the US in particular, in order not to liberate Ukraine, but to defeat Russia. See, I think the idea was a geopolitical war against Russia at the expense of Ukraine. In other words, the war would be fought till Russia's politically acknowledged defeat, while the last Ukrainian was being sacrificed in the process. So fighting Russia at the expense of the Ukrainians was, I think, a very immoral and imprudent and essentially wrong-headed kind of policy. And I think as much as I disfavor the Trump leadership, his approach, which is essentially diplomatic, though erasing Ukrainian agency, excluding Ukraine, is similar to what they do with Palestine. Mm-hmm. There is that analogy. But in the Israel-Palestine context, partly for reasons we've discussed, the fact that Israel has this network of Zionist support, including in the Western countries, and is viewed as a strategic asset in confronting the Islamic world as a whole, there's much less willingness to engage in any kind of diplomatic process.
So this is not really only solely an Israel-Palestine issue. This is more like a clash of maybe civilizations to a further extent. How would you name this precisely?
I sometimes have called it a second coming of Samuel Huntington, who initiated that language of clash of civilizations. Mm-hmm. And it is definitely, in my view, part of the context of the Israel-Palestine issue. Just as Ukraine, in a way, was partly seen as part of the Western civilization, so that the positive reaction in favor of Ukrainian opposition to Russia was consistent
Right.
in this broader sense with the support of Israel.
So any near future solution to this ongoing conflict, or we are not going to be able to see a permanent solution to this long tragedy, do you think? What is your, of course, wishful thinking leads us to some maybe analysis, but your honest opinion and analysis, what would that be?
Well, again, I'm
Without a crystal ball.
Yes. I needed a bunch of crystal balls to handle some of these questions. But one thing that's important in my own experience is the transformation of South Africa. Because I was in South Africa a year or two before the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. And no one there, regardless of their political outlook, either supportive or opposing the racist government, thought there was any possibility that Mandela would be released from prison, or that the regime would suddenly give up apartheid and agree to a constitutional process that left Africans in control of the government process. So history can surprise us. And in that sense, I believe in what I've sometimes called the politics of impossibility. That you should struggle for what you believe in, not what seems most likely.
One last question, final question, Professor. In all these conflicts, particularly Russia, Ukraine, and especially, of course, Israel-Palestine, how do you see Turkey's role in these conflicts?
I think on balance, Turkey is the only country that has played a consistently positive role in relation to Israel-Palestine by extending criticism of the way in which Israel has behaved, by seeking through private diplomacy a reconciliation between Hamas and the Israeli government. And it is quite dramatic that Hamas, after it succeeded in winning the election in 2006, which it had been encouraged by the U.S. to enter and to abandon armed struggle and participate in the political process, but it wasn't supposed to win. And when it won, it was denied the opportunity of participating in a political process which it wanted to participate in. I had, when I was UN Special Rapporteur, meetings with several of the Hamas leaders who were in exile in Qatar and in Egypt. And they were very convincing about the fact that they had used all the means at their disposal to persuade Washington that there would be great trouble if Israel didn't agree to a long-term ceasefire. And they proposed as long as 50 years of a ceasefire. They expected that to be accompanied by Israel's withdrawal from the occupied territory, particularly the West Bank. And that, of course, was the obstacle. Israel never intended to give up the occupied territories, and especially never intended after the rise of these religious right political parties and forming coalition with the Likud party, the right-wing secular party. That created a new kind of situation in Israel that defeated these earlier ideas that it would be possible to work out some long-term accommodation.
As much as Trump is a threat to international world and geopolitical conflicts in the region, he's a big threat, I think, to the institutions at home, in your country, in your own country, the US. What do you think about the future of the institutions, strong institutions once under the second Trump presidency, Professor? What are your thoughts about your own country in the US? What are the biggest threats that you face in the next 4 years? Briefly.
The threats domestically are devastating, and they're certain. They're not. The threats internationally are somewhat ambiguous and uncertain. But he has already, in less than 3 weeks, done incredible damage to the governing process, to the efforts at some kind of social policies that benefit the poor and vulnerable. He's also done dangerous things internationally outside of these conflict areas. He's weakened the UN by withdrawing from WHO and the Human Rights Council, and cutting off foreign economic assistance in an abrupt manner that doesn't allow for any kind of adjustment. He shows no empathy for people suffering, and that's a very dangerous quality. This kind of narcissistic leadership that is only concerned with the satisfaction of his own grandiose ambitions and visions, his idea of America, and now this strange marriage with Elon Trump, which...
So the second term will be more dangerous than the first one, I guess.
And he has, at present at any rate, a much stronger mandate.
Right.
He has control of all 3 branches of government, and he had a majority of the people behind him in the elections, which is quite shocking.
Well, good luck, Professor. Of course, I wish to talk to you for hours and hours, but I want to cut here. Thank you so much for your time. It was an honor for me to speak to you.
No, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Falk.
Thank you.
Teşekkür ederim, Profesör.
Teşekkürler.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda çok kıymetli bir kamusal entelektüeli aslında. Dünyanın en saygın, en önde gelen uluslararası hukuk uzmanlarından Princeton Üniversitesi Emeritus Profesörü Richard Falk'u ağırladık. Kendisi aynı zamanda Birleşmiş Milletler eski Filistin özel raportörü. Dolayısıyla bugün İsrail-Filistin ağırlıklı. Biraz da küresel düzenin bundan sonra nereye evrileceğine dair konuları da konuşmaya çalıştık. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.